Oh, hello, Hafide, and aloha. Thank you all for joining us again today. Welcome to the first webinar in the Pacific Desk 2022 webinar series. I'm David Hitzel, the Pacific Desk Guam instructor, or at least once upon a time, years ago before the pandemic. Today's topic of discussion is disaster management, early warning, early action in the Pacific. So the usual reminders before we begin: this is being recorded for educational and documentational purposes and will be posted simultaneously on Facebook Live. Please leave questions in the comment section and include your affiliation and location when you do so. You can ask questions also through Facebook Live, or you can wait till the end of the talk to ask them orally. However, while the rest of the talk is going on, please do not turn on your video or audio. And then, like I said, the video is being recorded, so I'll be sending out the YouTube link to that via email within a couple of days. Okay, so we went ahead and put together most of the schedule for the next 6 months. This webinar actually was supposed to occur in January, but due to obvious reasons related to our speaker, who does disaster management in the South Pacific, she wasn't available that day. But upcoming webinars, also related to the recent Tonga eruption, we'll be having an undersea volcanology, tsunamis, and the prediction of future eruptions webinar. This will be put on by the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And we will have 3 speakers actually for this one. There'll be an earthquake specialist, volcano hazard specialist, and also a undersea geological mapping specialist. So don't miss that one if you're interested in volcanoes and tsunamis. And then in April, we're putting together one for new caps, which is a product that's recently come into use in the Western Pacific with NOAA for predicting rainfall. So this is one of those products that uses sort of a combination of geostationary data and the microwave data to help predict rainfall, particularly from things like everyday trade wind showers. And in May, we're looking at one for about global sea level rise. So that'll be put on by the University of Hawaii Sea Level Center. And then one on tropical cyclones for June. That'll likely be the Weather Service here in Honolulu. And then for July and August, I'm going to put together something to do with hydrology, because we haven't covered that yet, and communications. Okay. So for today's speaker is Jen Stewart Manu. She is the Climate and Resilience Delegate, Country Cluster Delegation for the Pacific, a position with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies based in Fiji. In this position, she is the lead technical support for climate preparedness and resilience programming to support community preparedness with 12 Pacific Red Cross National Societies. Jennifer specializes in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, applying her longstanding team leadership and project management skills. She has extensive experience in providing community adaptation plans, disaster community response planning, and early warning preparedness with expertise, particularly in the Pacific. In the field of disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, she has worked as a consultant for Pacific Storian, as a program lead and UK humanitarian operations advisor for Save the Children, as well as senior program lead for the Australian Red Cross during Tropical Cyclone Winston recovery in Fiji. She has also led humanitarian response activities in Vanuatu, Iraq, Myanmar, and Nepal, as well as working at various positions in Zambia, Ghana, Liberia, Laos, and Ukraine. She has a master's degree in international development from the University of Manchester, where her dissertation concerned post-disaster reconstruction in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And she also has a Bachelor of Science in Geography and Geology. And our second speaker that I billed was Deborah Kun Wayu. She couldn't be here today because of a work obligation. But there's another speaker, Tamala Pita, and she's the Climate Action Officer from Tuvalu, the Tuvalu Red Cross. So she'll also be joining us today. Okay, and just a brief introduction to today's topic, early warning, early action. So my sort of cursory experience with this topic has to do with Guam, of course, and catastrophic typhoons that affect Guam. So basically, there are lessons from the past, and the lessons are you can't, when you're going to do a recovery operation, you can't always count on the infrastructure being intact after the event. So it might be a better idea, especially nowadays with improved forecasting due to improved modeling. It might be better to prepare as much as possible, get as much of the resources you need on the island, as many of the personnel that you're going to need on island before the event actually happens. Because you from past experience, you can't always count on the runways being intact. You can't always count on the ports being in good shape or in the shape that will allow any unloading of resources. And also, especially for islands that are long distances from support countries that could offer support, it's going to take time, especially with shipping, to get things there. It's going to take time, even with aircraft, and in some cases. So yeah, the case of Pong Son Hua in Guam, where the port was shut down by a fire for several days, and then there was a lot of local infrastructure damage to the power grid. So in retrospect, it's been found that it might be a better gamble to prepare in advance. Okay, and then before I let Jennifer take over, I just wanted to mention, because I was on the internal email thread when this was all going on, and basically when the eruption happened, soon afterwards, particularly due to the tsunami, due to the ash cloud, much of the communications in Tonga, if not all, were severed. And that was largely due to the fact that the undersea communications cable was literally severed. But thankfully, the Chatty Beetle, which is this two-way Iridium satellite-based message system, which is actually a crucial part of the Pacific Desk communications training program, was successful in transmitting messages not only between islands in Tonga, but out to the Fiji Met Service, the WMO, and NOAA, and other worldwide agencies, when all other communications were basically cut. So the Chatty Beetle was able to send out messages 11 minutes after the eruption, and to a large extent, besides HF radio, this is the way that families in Tonga were actually able to communicate and let others on other islands and out in the world know that they were okay. So I just wanted to mention that. And then, okay, and so from there, I'll let Jennifer and Tamala take over.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for the warm welcome.
Sure.
And I'll perhaps let TJ say a few words as well, but let me share my screen, and we can kick off. How does that look?
Looks good to me.
All right. So thank you, David. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in your webinar series. Definitely looking like a very exciting set of topics this year. And I hope this one kicks us all off well. And apologies for having to delay it. As David mentioned, we were pretty busy with Tonga response this last sort of 6 weeks. And our colleague Deb also has been involved in some support in Samoa. There's some challenge there with COVID at the moment, and working as well. So Deb sends her apologies. And we're very lucky to have Tamala join us today. So Tamala is our Climate Action Officer for Tuvalu Red Cross, recently appointed, but no stranger to this work. So thank you, TJ, for joining us. And maybe I can just pass to you and you can just say a couple of words, introduce yourself.
All right, thanks, Jen, for the introduction. Just a quick background on myself. So yes, as Jen said, recently appointed Climate Action Officer here for the Tuvalu Red Cross Society. I've had experience in the climate change field through volunteer work under Tuvalu, or recently or formerly called 350 Tuvalu. I've had experiences through COP23. I've attended under the Pacific Climate Warriors, as well as working under the Department of Climate Change here under the government of Tuvalu, taking part in the Tuvalu Integrated Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment. That's a little bit about myself and my work, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, TJ. Nice one. So yeah, I think today we're just gonna go through a little bit of the work that Red Cross is involved in terms of early warning, early action, forecasting, and one tool that we have in particular called the Earwatch. And we'll get a bit of an insight of how that was used a little bit later on in Tuvalu itself, which is great to have a real example. And TJ can speak to some of that as well. So we're just gonna maybe take a step back and have a little bit of a background just generally to situate us in I guess what Red Cross understands and means by sort of preparedness, disaster preparedness, DRR, disaster risk management, and then where climate fits in all of that. And perhaps, yeah, that will help us a little bit in terms of how we're using forecasting and modeling and things like that. But if anyone has any questions throughout, please feel free to ask us. I think I can see my screen. It should pop up with notification. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat. And I think we have some time at the end as well for some questions. So I'll kick us off just briefly with a bit of obviously background. I think we're all familiar, of course, now with climate change and understanding concepts around this and how climate change is going to trigger, you know, changes very broadly across very many different aspects. Variability of weather parameters, increase in frequency and intensity of extreme events, increase in temperatures, heat waves, affecting sea level rise, which you have a topic on coming up, which is exciting. And of course, the impacts of areas outside our region, potentially melting glaciers and shifting in season, that seasonality. And then how that affecting our traditional risk management methodologies, particularly across our Red Cross specific national societies, and then the communities we work with, and then the government institutions that we partner with and are affiliated with. And often now we're seeing they're not necessarily as adequate as they were before. And so due to climate change in the Pacific Islands, we're going to be facing disasters in different ways of a different nature. So as well as this increasing frequency, we're seeing larger scale impacts, and we're seeing sort of a combination of disasters happening concurrently, which is really affecting our ability to respond. And so we're looking at ways to enhance and increase our ability to predict, plan, and scenario build in particular contexts, what that can look like for our ability to respond and our ability to support affected communities. So this can look like, communities facing extreme weather risks, changes in health risks, diminished food security, water supply, increases in things like migration, which is population pressure on various parts of communities, urban centers, etc. And so that is looking at how vulnerability to the people that we're working with is going to be increased, and further demands will be added to existing capacity. So how can we match that? How can we match that in resources and assets? And you can just see on screen here is just a really incredible visual of TC Yasa making landfall in Fiji, and that was in December 2020. And of course, since then, Fiji has faced cyclones, COVID outbreak, and impacts of the Tonga tsunami concurrently at the same time. So we saw the sort of trifecta of disasters happening in Fiji, and it's really stretched and tested our ability to respond. And something that we're seeing, which David mentioned right at the beginning, is around that ability to be prepared, what we're preparing for, but also that local capacity and having those pre-positioned material stocks, things available. Because as we saw in Tonga, infrastructure can be damaged, and that really does impact how resources can reach in country. So where we're able, increasing those resources and capacity is really, really useful. So I'll just pass to TJ, who will talk a little bit about disasters, hazards, and risks. And just on mute there, TJ.
Sorry. Thanks, Jen. So hopefully you guys can all hear me now. We're talking about disasters, hazards, and risk reduction. We should first talk about what is a hazard. So oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, but there is a big difference between hazards and disasters. And that's where risk reduction becomes important. When we talk about hazards, they're defined as dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or conditions that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. When we talk about disaster and what it is, it's a series of disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events, interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one of more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. As you guys can see from that slide. Yeah. Okay. Now we're talking about disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Let's spend a few moments looking at disaster management. When we talk about disaster management, it deals with all humanitarian aspects of emergencies, in particular preparedness, response, and recovery, in order to lessen the impacts of disasters. It's one of the core functions of Red Cross and what national societies are often known for, which is saving lives and assisting people affected with disasters, as well as preparing to respond to future events and reducing people's vulnerability to expected hazards. Disaster risk reduction is commonly known through its acronym DRR, and it's an integral part of disaster management. I think that's it from here. At the next slide. So we're talking about preparedness now. Preparedness is the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, and current disasters. So preparedness action is carried out within the context of disaster risk management, and it mainly aims to build the capacities needed to efficiently plan and manage all types of emergencies, and then achieve orderly transitions from respond to sustained recovery. The UNDRR terminology talks about how preparedness is based on a sound analysis of disaster risk and good linkages and early warning systems. It includes such activities such as contingency planning, the stockpiling of equipment and supplies, the development of arrangement of coordination, evacuation and public information, and associated training and field exercises. There must be supported by formal institutions, legal and budgetary capacities. The related term readiness describes the ability to quickly and appropriately respond to when it's required. So a preparedness plan, it's established arrangements in advance to enable timely, effective, and appropriate responses to specific potential hazardous events or emerging disaster situations that might threaten society or the environment. I think for the next slide, I'll hand it back to Jen.
Great. Thanks so much, TJ. Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points in there around readiness, preparedness, the link within the disaster risk management cycle. But where does that all lead us for, including things like climate change, and how do we mitigate and prepare for climate change, and then how do we adapt to that, those challenges that we face? And so addressing climate variability and climate change can't really be done in a standalone way or its own project. We do often have bespoke programs that particularly target either climate mitigation or climate action, but within every other program, we really now should be considering the impacts of climate change. And a lot of that is now being incorporated within the work we do, particularly now looking at how we can, consider the impact of COVID, for example, across the Pacific, and how we can think about that challenge and those changes in communities and societies, and linking that with broader impacts that we'll see from climate change. So for example, we'll get to it a bit later on, but when we're facing periods of extended dry and potential drought, how do we think about hand washing for preparedness, for general hygiene and prevention of disease, but particularly for COVID? So we tend to look now at early warning systems to help us be able to not only prepare and be ready, but also think about this in a kind of different timescales, which we'll look through. So much of this process and the design, these actions, we need to look at them quite differently for different hazards as well, which makes it quite complicated. So information that we gather might help determining the scale, the location, the time frame of different actions that we can take. And then we'll discuss now some of those and how that might look. So I just wanted to show you a quick video. This one's just about a minute long, and then there's another one after. And we'll just have a quick look at an example of start our conversation about monitoring forecasts, and an example giving us, what that looks like, to help us start having conversations about, okay, what does climate change mean? What does it mean in the short, medium, and long term? So let's see if we can play this video. And you can let me know. Hope you can hear the audio. That's always the tricky part, isn't it? Can you see my screen with the video? Does it looking good?
Yep, I can see it.
Yeah, perfect. All right, let me know if you can hear the audio. Should be music.
No audio.
No audio. See, I knew we were almost there. All right, let me just try a new share. All right. All right. Let's try. We'll get it right for the next video. Okay. Okay, let's give that a go. Can you see the screen again?
Yep.
Perfect. Good for audio?
Yep, sounds good.
Kia ora and welcome to the Island Climate Update for February through to April. La Nina conditions remain in the equatorial Pacific. However, upper oceanic heat content increased in the western and central Pacific during January, signaling the decay of La Nina. La Nina is expected to continue during February through to April with a 75% chance, but between May to July there is a 65% chance for the re-emergence of ENSO-neutral conditions. Taking a look at the rainfall outlook for the next 3 months, below normal rainfall is forecast for the countries that you see on screen. Normal or above normal rainfall is forecast for the Northern Marianas. Above normal rainfall is forecast for Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, the Marshall Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, Niue, the Southern Cook Islands, and the Austral Islands. Part of several island groups may experience high water stress over the next 3 months. This includes the Solomon Islands, Nauru, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Samoa, American Samoa, the Marquesas, and the Pitcairn Islands. If you'd like to see the full outlook, please visit niwa.co.nz.
Great. So I really like that format and that update from New Zealand Bureau of Meteorology. It's simple, it's super straightforward. It feels like a normal weather forecast, but of course it's an outlook for the next 3 months. So it's in some ways a lot more useful than a usual forecast. So we use this information, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, with how we use some of these, and particularly actually the tools and information that we get from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and a partnership program we work with called the COSPAC program, which looks at kind of the ocean and sea surface temperature and lots of rainfall information. We use that to model. So we'll come on to that. But really what we're looking at, is tools that we need to use to be able to help us manage climate risk, reduce vulnerability, build capacity, where we need this data and this information and this science now to help us forecast what meteorological conditions we'll see. And these can be kind of daily and then into long range forecasts, as I mentioned. And so particularly climate risk management takes everything of this into account. So it's a combination of dealing with both these long-term changes, extreme events, and using information about these to enhance our decision making and our ability to prepare, be ready, and then respond. And then, as Tamala mentioned, this kind of moving into the recovery phase. So we're really trying to enhance our resources, our tools, to be able to do this a lot more effectively and efficiently, and to be able to do that potentially ahead of actually responding, but doing more early warning leading to early action. So really trying to be on the forefront, be ahead of information, be able to do a lot of these actions, whether that's pre-positioning stock or training communities and things like that. And we'll come to some of that shortly. So looking a bit more then into how and what monitoring forecasts is, just change my slide. So we have a little bit of a slide here, which just talks a little bit about the what, the how, and the who. So the what, as I said, it's just forecasting. So it's a statement explaining what meteorological conditions we can expect for a specific time, for a specific location. And it often gives us information on the likelihood or the probability of an event happening. So the likelihood and probability of that information being accurate, which is something we really have to take into account. So it's kind of like your daily weather forecast, there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow in, wherever you are in Vanuatu, say, or for TJ. And what that looks like then on the longer term is something that we're looking at trying to improve, all the modeling, trying to improve that over the longer term. And then the how is, forecasting is forecasters using as many sources of information to make forecasts as reliable and as informative as possible. So we have current and recent weather conditions that can help us. We have models of how kind of air and water move around. We've got past data, which conditions can, give us some indications and be linked to specific events. We've got, existing expertise, and then we have traditional local forecasts, of course, as well, made based on current observations and weather stations, local weather stations and satellites. And then usually, of course, this is the role of the National Met Services and the Hydrological Services. And we've been trying a lot more now across the Pacific to try and link our regional work with what's happening at the national level. So when we talk about the ear watch, which I'll explain, we'll talk about how we are able to now use some of the existing national ear watches as well to complement the regional work. Yeah. So maybe we can just look at, speaking of the when, so I spoke briefly about, we all know, traditional weather forecasts, how's the weather this week? And they're usually pretty good in terms of accuracy, but that forecast skill, we call it, does decrease with time. So you can see these kind of 3 lines here. The longer the forecast, the lower the skill, so the lower the accuracy. And that's something that we try to really bear in mind when we're looking at these longer term outlooks, what the kind of level of accuracy. Sometimes it can be high, especially when it's linked with past data, and the kind of current outlook can be very accurate, but sometimes the data isn't super clear or hasn't got much in the way of historical data to support. So sometimes the skill goes down. So what else can I tell you about this? So really what we're trying to do here is looking at the lead time. So the amount of time that there is in advance of an event, the forecast is helping us to try to predict. So with the weather forecast, you have your 1 to 15 days, and they would generally tend to be clear, as I said, but they're not so good afterwards at, telling you a bit further on what's going to happen. So then we would have to move to sub-seasonal or seasonal forecasts. And this can be 50 days, maybe up to 100 days kind of before seasonal. And seasonal doesn't mean autumn, winter, spring. In this case, it means 3 monthly, just to confuse us. But it's important to note that seasonal forecasts are different, of course, from weather forecasts, and they provide a different probability, and it's more less clear, and it's more kind of an outlook and a forecast and a prediction. So they typically are telling us, that there's an enhanced chance of above normal or below normal, as you saw in the NIWA video, as to what extent we expect these things to happen. But there's still some chance that that rainfall is going to change across that period, of course. But that is what it will tell us. It's below the normal, it's normal, or it's above normal. And we'll talk about this as well in the ear watch. So yeah, these are the kind of tools that we use, and we use both of these actually. So we have the other, the short-term forecast. So it's a fortnightly forecast that we get, and what we use that for is, so I share it comes out every week for the coming fortnight, and I share that with the team, particularly useful when we're in the middle of a response. So for example, for Tonga or for Fiji right now, where we're doing some recovery work, how's the coming 2 weeks looking? Because if we have big distributions planned, or if we have, lots of resources coming in country, is there going to be a period of extremely heavy rainfall? Or are we looking at a continued period of dry, where we need to consider, what our activities are? If we've got a big push on hand washing, but it's, a period of extended dry, and those the coming 2 weeks are reflecting this longer term situation. It really gives us some context to the activities that we're going to be doing and how we can begin to plan them and adjust them. So we use the 2 week forecast, and then the 3 month one, as I say, we'll come to. And this table really just gives you a bit more of the detail on some of the other kinds of forecasts. So you can see there's like 7 different kinds here. We won't go into them all today, but just to give you that kind of framing of what is available and the amount of information that we can use, to what different time scale we can use it. Obviously, this is not all available in all of our countries, in all of our places that we work. We don't have access to all 7 of these types of information, unfortunately. But you know, this is kind of what we do have across and broadly to be able to rely on in different ways at various points. So let's have a look then at the why. Well, I think we've kind of covered this a little bit, but you know, using this climate science, it really helps us to be able to prepare, as I mentioned before, this short-term information plus the long-term really gives us that really specific and contextually accurate kind of ability to plan out, to scenario plan, and help people with, you know, even things like livelihoods, and over the long term, what climate smart infrastructure can we be looking at, because we know in a particular context that we're going to face these kinds of challenges, for example, you know, high cyclonic winds or things like this. So we're able to kind of look at that and really prioritize the most vulnerable. We try as Red Cross to do what we call reaching the last mile. And in the Pacific, that's particularly challenging. Of all regions I've worked, it's definitely one of the most difficult in our region here, given the logistical challenges of reaching outer islands, for example, the time it takes and the cost, and being able to, you know, have the capacity and the ability to transport the things that we need. So using forecasts and it kind of enables us to get a sense of what hazards we face, as TJ was mentioning at the beginning, what hazards we face and what disasters they might cause. Where, affecting who, which the most vulnerable population, as I mentioned, and then that helps us with our ability to plan early action. And as I said at the beginning, this is something we're really trying to focus on now, and not so much be in a headspace of kind of response, but what can we be looking at ahead of that? So we can use all these forecasts and this information and, you know, to be able to kind of anticipate and think about what we can do. And one of those things is also looking at kind of financing. So we have tools called forecast-based financing, very complicated, and we're beginning to look at them for the Pacific. They're happening in other institutions. For Red Cross, it's becoming a conversation that we're having, and we'll speak to that a bit later with our Tuvalu example. And so what we are looking at with forecast-based financing is kind of what it sounds like. We're using forecasts to help us get financing to take action. So they can be set up at different levels. As I say, a little bit complicated, but we're using things like forecasts as triggers to help us access funding to be able to take action before the event happens. So before the disaster happens, before the kind of impacts are seen, we can be taking early action to reduce the effects and the impacts of those disasters when they come. I think one really important point here on this slide. So we've got here, you know, despite the mounting impacts of climate change, only 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 people are still not adequately covered by early warning systems. So that's kind of a huge amount. And those that are covered, it's inconsistent often. Data is often not always available. Information that doesn't necessarily reach the right people at the right time. People at that last mile, the most vulnerable, aren't receiving information efficiently or clearly or in a timely way. So where the systems do exist, they're not running and being run optimally at the moment in many places. So it's a real challenge if you think that, you know, when you think about the concept of having information and knowing something's going to happen and not being able to tell anybody. So that's the kind of area that we're in when we're thinking about early warning systems. We know something's happening and we can't tell anybody about it. And that's the gap we try to close with many other organizations and national governments working a lot on this space at the moment. And as it says there, early warning, early action can save lives and assets worth at least 10 times the cost. So this is a concept from decades ago. I remember when I first started many years ago, and we were, even then we were talking about, you know, the cost of response and recovery is 10 times the cost of preparedness and early action. So we can save money and, of course, more importantly, saving people's lives. So we talked a little bit about what we heard in the video about the concept of the La Nina in the ENSO period that we're having right now. So we're experiencing the La Nina phase days. And I just wanted to show you a video on that. It's kind of a fun video. It's about 5 minutes long, but you guys can let me know maybe if you've seen it before, because I know it's quite a popular one. So it's the climate crab video. So maybe if you just put your hands up, I can see the participants list. If you've seen it before, and maybe if the majority of people have seen it, we can just put it in the link in the chat box. But if not, I'd be happy to show it you. It's a sort of cartoon video about what La Nina and El Nino are and how it affects us, and how it's really important for us to understand what state we're in, you know, alongside understanding our forecasting and our current climate outlooks. So I don't see any hands up. Maybe it can be something new. I'll keep an eye on the window for a second. Oh, Tamala's seen it. Perfect. Awesome. I would hope my Red Cross colleagues have actually seen this one. Yeah, let's have a watch of it. It's a little bit longer. It's about 4 minutes long. It's kind of a fun one, and it's really great now because this is being shown and being translated into different languages across the Pacific. So it's really good tool. So let me show you that. And again, let me know if you can hear the audio. I think I've cracked it this time, so fingers crossed. Okay, all good?
All good.
Our story begins in the warm pool, a place in the Pacific where the trade winds meet the world's warmest ocean. Here, clouds form as warm air rises. Across the Pacific, clouds gather at 3 large meeting places. These meeting places have big scientific names. There's the South Pacific Convergence Zone, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, and the West Pacific Monsoon. These cloud meeting places move throughout the year, causing the usual wet seasons and dry seasons. Some years they move to different areas because of changes in trade winds and ocean temperatures. This in turn causes changes to rainfall, sea levels, and tropical cyclone risk. Scientists call these changes in the air and ocean El Nino and La Nina. In an El Nino event, trade winds weaken, warmer water moves to the east, and the cloud meeting places move closer together. El Nino brings big changes to the temperature, rain, and sea level in our region. In some countries, such as Papua New Guinea and Palau, and lower sea levels, sometimes leading to food and water shortages. During El Nino, tropical cyclone risk increases in the east, in places like the southern Cook Islands and Samoa. And in countries along the equator like Kiribati, El Nino usually brings more rain and sometimes higher sea levels, which can lead to flooding. It can also mean a better time to catch tuna in Kiribati, as the fish follow the warmer water into this area. El Nino and its impacts usually last for 1 year, and then things return to normal. But El Nino can last longer. In some years, the opposite of an El Nino occurs. Scientists call this La Nina. In a La Nina event, the trade winds get stronger, pushing warmer water to the west and the cloud meeting places further apart. In some countries close to the equator, such as Tuvalu and Nauru, La Nina can bring less rain and even drought. This can affect locally grown food sources like taro, banana, and breadfruit, and sometimes lead to water shortages. In other countries like Fiji and the Solomon Islands, La Nina usually brings warmer oceans, more rain, and can cause flooding. This can lead to coral bleaching, waterlogged crops, and increased risk of diseases like typhoid and dengue fever.
In the Solomon Islands, La Nina also causes higher sea levels.
El Nino and La Nina are not climate change. They are part of the natural climate system. El Nino and La Nina will continue to happen in the future, but climate change may intensify some of their impacts. Learning how to adapt to the ups and downs of El Nino and La Nina will help to prepare for long-term climate change.
Some El Nino and La Nina events are more severe than others. Your local weather office is always watching El Nino and La Nina to provide temperature, rain and cyclone forecasts that your island is likely to receive in the months ahead. It's important to undertake activities to prepare your area for the impacts of El Nino and La Nina events. There are many ways to do this. Be sure to keep up to date with the forecast from your local weather office and take time to make plans for the season ahead.
Great. Hopefully you caught most of that, but I'll share the link with David, and hopefully we can have that available for anyone who wants to watch it again. It is a really great video to share and explain, and as it rightly says, of course the Enzo El Nino La Nina situation isn't climate change, but is being impacted by in terms of the severity. So it's something that we always look at, of where we are in the kind of in the cycle. So let's have a look where we are now. Let's share again the screen. So we are currently sitting, when the screen lit, there we go. So we're currently sitting in La Nina, and forecasts telling us that we're reaching at the peak, or either have already reached the peak of a kind of La Nina season, and it's potentially going to start tailing off maybe around March, April, but that is updated kind of every month when we look at the coming months ahead. So it does change. Originally, it was hoped that the La Nina phase would be finished by now, by February, but it's continuing. And then, so you can see on the slide here, this is telling us what it's generally like across the kind of Western tropical Pacific. With the yellow part here showing us potentially it will be drier than average. And then with the blue areas, it's going to be wetter than average. So again, we'll talk about what this kind of means, and the wetter than normal and things a bit more. But this is quite a good graphic to show you broadly what we would see. And I think that is what we're seeing at this stage when we're looking at the outlooks that we're getting through. For example, the NOAA video that we just shared, that was for the coming 3 months. That was February, March, April, I think. And it was showing us, potentially some dry, extended periods of dry, and the water stress, which is really helpful. So, often, and again, as we'll see in the Tuvalu example, there can be a period of extended dry meteorologically. But does that mean that people themselves are being affected and under water stress, or do people have enough resources? So that's kind of one of the other tools that we look at to help us understand forecast and outlook information that helps us understand the local context when we're either in a current response situation or we potentially might be watching out for a need for us to be able to respond. So it's really important to know what state we're in. And so we've talked a little bit about this already, the need to, get this information, get this data, and then be able to prepare for either response or early action, or just to be able to do some of the activities in the video that we just shared. Then, be able to learning to know how to adapt was, I think, the phrase in the video, which I think is really exciting and a really important message. And of course, people have been doing it for years, and we have so much information around with traditional knowledge as well, which plays a huge part and is continuing to play a huge part. And so we look at kind of contingency plans. And now we're looking, as I mentioned right at the beginning, kind of new worst case scenarios, you know, really looking at how we're being able to manage some of these compound risks and some of this aggregate disaster situations, and even some of these cyclical things. So we might see something in Fiji, as I mentioned, we've got a cyclone, we've got a tsunami impact, and we have COVID outbreak all at the same time, but we might see something cyclical like a drought, a cyclone, and a drought, which again, it's requiring a different level of preparedness, different kinds of preparedness, different scenario planning, different standard operating procedures that we at Red Cross would, you know, generally use. So we look at realistic worst case scenarios. We look at the kind of new weather extremes that we think we might face, you know, across the region. And then, as I mentioned, looking more, hopefully more detailed if the country's got national weather watches, national year watches, you know, across the region. And we also have, you know, support trying to reach out with the local Met services. So helping our national societies link in more with departments of climate change or the national Met and hydrological departments and things like that. Yeah, so we try to do that capacity building as part of one of the activities, and as part of the contingency planning as well. So essentially the concept, as we've been talking about, is, you know, if you get a warning for extreme weather in the coming days, it doesn't give us a chance to do a lot in terms of repositioning stock, for example. But if you get a warning months or a good few weeks in advance, there's things that we can do. You know, we can restock warehouses locally, or even try to procure things regionally or indeed internationally if we must. And, you know, we're able to scenario plan which areas might be impacted and prioritize and mobilize into those specific areas. For example, volunteers with early warning information can go to communities, warn people, prepare people, inform people. Like I was saying before, having this information that something's going to happen and not being able to reach people, that's the gap we're trying to close. So the kind of long-term plan is to try to be doing this more frequently and more kind of holistically as well. So we'll just take a look at, yeah, generally warning systems now. So we talked a bit about this, what they mean and how they kind of, you know, are particularly important for us, how we use this information, how we are able to support taking action before disaster strikes in order to reduce negative impacts, making full use of the scientific information on the local scale, improving our risk information. So one of the things we do as Red Cross is often the VCA activities with communities, which is the vulnerability capacity assessments. And that's all really needing this enhanced approach now, which looks kind of at different scales. It looks at different types of vulnerability, and it looks at different types of capacities that we haven't really considered before. And, you know, to really help us take this action before. And so in terms of warning systems, we see much challenge, and we see much opportunity for progress. But I guess one question which I might put to you, and I'll put it on the screen, is what barriers do you think people would face to be able to kind of take action on early warning information? So I'll put a question to the group and you guys can have a little think about it. But, you know, really thinking about all the things we've talked about already, you know, timescales and access to information, what do you think are some of the barriers people would face at community level? And you can just drop it in the chat box. You can just pop any thoughts or ideas in there to some of the barriers, because obviously this all sounds great. You know, the more information we have, the better. The earlier we have it, the better. The more people we can reach with the information, the better. But it's unfortunately not that easy to do. It's not that straightforward. So maybe from your thoughts after what we've been saying this morning, is there anything that you think would be particularly difficult? So I see some answers coming in the chat box now, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. There's lots of different challenges, but yeah, I think from Jimmy is saying credible information, absolutely. Coconut wireless, absolutely. So really trying to make sure that correct, accurate information is being shared. That is a huge one and a really good point, because, what we see is a lot of Chinese whispers and information getting distilled, and also information coming from different sources, which can be really confusing to communities. So we've seen some fantastic examples in the Pacific from Vanuatu and Tuvalu, sharing good information consistently. Sometimes timeliness is a challenge, but it should be all coming from one place. We also have relatively poor sub-seasonal forecasts. Yes, so David's saying that one in the middle, so the kind of fortnightly one is okay, the outlook is pretty good, but this sub-seasonal one has been a particular challenge and could be really, really helpful. And it's something I know that particularly the Australian Bureau of Meteorology is trying to improve now with satellite information. So trying not to just rely on weather station information, but moving as well to satellite. Yeah, and we also have, credibility, trust. Hard for some people to understand. Yes, exactly. So even if we can give people warnings about coming events, when they're potentially going to be quite catastrophic, like maybe that we saw in Tonga, that we've seen in PG Vanuatu with the big cyclones, it's very hard to conceptualize what that means, what that looks like, how it's going to impact you as an individual, your household, your community, etc. And then of course you have the flip side, where people don't take advice when it is given. People crying wolf, absolutely. How can we take away the potential warning that something might happen? So for example, tsunami warnings are a classic example of that. And then nothing major happens. So with the Tonga tsunami, we had some tsunami warnings here. And luckily, really, because it was low tide, we saw the wave retreat, the sea level retreat, and we saw it return. But luckily, it was low tide, so the impact of the reach wasn't so significant. There was some damage in the outer islands, but again, people very aware, very prepared, very kind of vigilant, and then nothing really happens. So how do we keep encouraging people to continuously be vigilant? What else have we got in the chat? These are some really great answers. Thanks everyone for participating. Maybe I'll just take this last one. Yeah, some false optimism. It won't be that bad, or it won't affect me, or it won't affect my family. I guess some of that is hope, isn't it, that we don't have to face these disasters. But I think one of the key messages that we're saying, that I've kind of been saying a lot today, is, this kind of new normal, hate to use the phrase, but that we're seeing of these aggregate, consistent or cyclical disasters, and that we're needing to change the way that we prepare for them. And yeah, exactly. And how do we get the right information about, earthquake information, Jimmy is saying here around, and does that always trigger a tsunami? There's a lot of confusion around that kind of technical understanding of things. And, in one area, there's confusion and challenges where some other information, for example, cyclone information, can be very clear. But if you have this disconnect of information, sometimes that can lead to distrust. So we have lots of challenges, and you guys have brought them out really, really well. So thank you for that. I think there's some really brilliant information in there. And it's something that we definitely are seeing across the Pacific, I think globally as well. That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's have a look at the next slide. Oh, I think we have one last one from David. Yeah, post-disaster result. Yeah, exactly. So if we're trying to prepare and we're trying to do pre-positioned stocks, there's only a certain amount of time available for some of these stocks to be used and be utilized. So how much do we want to prepare, and what timeframes do we have to do preparedness actions? And actually, one of a good example I've seen use of some of the near, what do we call it, near end of life goods in that stocking warehouse. We'll do a scenario, or we'll do a drill, or we'll do like a few day simulation, and we use some of the stock to do that practice, to practice our disaster management activities, the response activities. In Palau, the RDATs, the Response Disaster Action Team, I think they're called, very fancy. We'll do practice runs with some of these near end to life, and then we have to look at restocking and that sort of thing. Brilliant, thanks everybody. Maybe actually I can just ask David for a time check. How are we doing? Got about 20 minutes left, is it?
Yeah, so it's 4:05 over here. So you have half an hour.
Okay, good.
I mean, leave a little time for questions. I think they'll be
We will. Yes, brilliant. And you know, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I'll just keep going through, and then yeah, we'll have some time for questions at the end. But that was really great. Thank you so much, everybody. And so what we do to try to combat some of those challenges then is, particularly in this early warning space, is do what we have essentially here on screen, and that's kind of linking in with the national level preparedness and early warning systems where possible. And this is a huge undertaking. You know, it's not a small project. It's not something that we can do easily. It's a long-term commitment with our stakeholders, our national climate and hydrological services, the climate change departments in you know, across 12 countries is particularly difficult. And that cooperation that we look for in, you know, with NDMOs and etc., to be able to try to link a lot of this messaging and look for those gaps, look for some of that inconsistency, look to build some of that trust that you were all mentioning then, and you know, trying to look at some of those forecast-based financing mechanisms so that when things do happen, we have funds available. We're not waiting, and we'll talk about that with Tuvalu example, but also in Fiji with the cyclone that I showed you at the beginning. We had some really strong, really good indications that this cyclone was going to hit Fiji strongly and significantly. And as Red Cross, we were able to apply for funding ahead of it making landfall. So the funding came in roughly around the same time as the cyclone making landfall, which meant that we could respond immediately and not have to wait for, you know, donors and, you know, NGOs and other agencies to kind of activate their funding mechanisms and things. So that was a really successful kind of you know, use and ability to take the information and take early action, which we haven't done before in the Pacific. And then we did again then with Tuvalu with a slow onset, which is another difficult scenario. And yeah, then, you know, if we've got national level, we've got our ministries and our agencies that we're working with, and then of course at the community level, because informal you know, warning systems exist, of course, at community level with existing traditional knowledge and existing systems that are in place. And so we really look to try and build on those, enhance those, and look to be able to kind of establish stronger and more efficient warning systems, which, as I say, try to reach the last mile. And again, very complicated because, of course, we have multi-hazards to be looking at. And how do you look at warning systems for multi-hazards for different groups of people in different scenarios? And then the needs and the early actions, of course, for each hazard are very different. So we try to look at, you know, prioritizing those hazards, most likely, as I mentioned before, this kind of scenario, building of the most likely scenario. And then generally, yes, just overall advocacy about the situation and the ability to kind of look at policy at government level, regional engagement, and then again, advocating for the most vulnerable, the most at risk. So I'll just pass across to TJ, who's going to just talk us through some of the steps that we can take for early action. We've touched on them briefly, but I'll just pass on and hopefully, yeah, TJ can give us some examples a little bit as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, for that. So now we're going to be talking about warning systems. Undertaking the early warning and early action requires climate and disaster risk actors across scales to work together to pre-agree to many things. The slide could be used to start a short brainstorm on the questions on the slide. So what happens is we can discuss the following questions. So who should be a part of the early warning, early action decision-making and action taking? What warning information is available and appropriate for the hazard context? Which actions will be the warning information trigger? When will the actions be taken, and who is responsible for taking actions at national and subnational and community level? So for this, do we have time to group up and discuss, or should we just go through?
Yeah, maybe we can just do your examples, and but we can share the questions in case, you know, there's kind of any interest for people to do like subgroup work and stuff like that for now. But I think we might be stuck for time a little bit. Yeah, thanks, TJ.
All right, so just put it up to the floor if they how to go about this. Is that all right, Jen?
Yeah, I think maybe if anyone has any ideas on, they can put it in the chat, but maybe you just carry on with the examples that we have or that you have there is all right. And then if anyone has anything additional, just pop it in the chat box and I'll have a look.
All right, that sounds good. So such examples, they include establishing good working relationships with partners and stakeholders. So these include national hydro meteorological services, disaster risk management agencies, research institutions, media, etc. And also representative of vulnerable groups and communities. The thought is that through these partnerships, the National Society can develop a systematic and comprehensive flow of relevant information on potential disasters. So collaborating with relevant agencies and stakeholders is very important in this sense. Yeah. Just taking a look at the comments. So we're gonna go to the next slide. As the climate changes, we can expect more extreme and or frequent weather events. So it depends on the hazard and location. Risks for human and natural systems will increase, being generally greater for disadvantaged people and also poorer communities. The early warning, early action support in managing these changes by being part of preparedness aspects of each country's national disaster management strategy. And also usually national disaster management authorities, such as the National Disaster Management Office here in Tuvalu and National Hydro Met Services, such as the Met Service here in Tuvalu, or other alerting authorities, they are mandated to lead and engage other stakeholders in early warning, early action initiatives. However, though, the Red Cross Red Crescent is uniquely positioned to partner with mandated entities to support community level early warning, early action initiatives and to advocate for community participation. So we truly here in Tuvalu at the National Society, we really play that auxiliary role towards the government. I think for the next slide, I'll give it back to Jen to talk more about the Ear Watch.
Thanks, TJ. That's great. Yeah, I think there's lots in there around the unpacking action and those different components of who, what, which, when, who, why. And there's some good comments in the chat here as well around, particularly around who. And, I think perhaps the role of Red Cross is really trying to support, as we said, engaging with most vulnerable people and of course the well-known kind of vision of people who have less access or people with disability. Nothing about us without us is the well-known kind of phrase and right kind of approach that Red Cross particularly and many NGOs beginning to take now, because of course we've seen lots of situations where people have been bypassed and expectations around what should be done for people, but not including them as leaders in these decisions. And something that I think we look at now around particularly these actions around preparedness must and should include, as I say, the people the most vulnerable, the most risk, because when we come to developing systems and processes, they must work for the people we're trying to work with. And without those people, we are unable to do that. I think, some really, really good thoughts there, and thinking about how we can build these relationships with people and stakeholders across all parts of the community at the different levels as well, and be able to link those, particularly link those up. So linking community with national government, and doing that as TJ said in that auxiliary way that Red Cross does. So I think. I think we can just we can move on and just look maybe at the last couple of things that we have to share with you today. And as TJ mentioned, the tool that we use, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, so now I can show you, is the Earwatch. So it's our tool that we use regionally, and it's the early warning, early action kind of tool. So it stands for Early Action Rainfall Watch. And you can just see a little snippet of it on the screen there. I know it's really small, but I'll unpack it a little bit. And what we use this for, as I've said, what do we use this for? Well, what we're trying to do is a lot of what we've discussed is use the information, use the data, use a lot of these tools to be able to understand what we're facing, what the region looks like. So it's a seasonal scale rainfall monitoring and forecast bulletin. It's a mouthful. And it's an internal tool for Red Cross, but we use publicly available data to develop it. And it's really something that we've started to look at as something that's kind of a trigger for activities, for action, for conversations, for engagement. And there's two main elements to it. There's the outlook, which is obviously what we've talked about a lot today, but there's also another component to it, which is the status, so rainfall status, and we'll have a look in a sec what that means. And using those two pieces of information, we're able to develop a sort of action table specific to country. So it changes every month, depending on the outlook and depending on the status. So it gives us this heads up. It tells us where there's an increased level of risk of drier or wetter than normal conditions. And based on this information, we, again, as I mentioned, we link where we can with national Met services, where they've developed their own early action rainfall watch, which often can be much more specific because it's obviously national level. And it helps us to have conversations about preparedness and about early action that we might want to take in certain circumstances. And so it's basically these different components. So we have status, and I'll flick through these super quick because it's just a copy of you know, how we look at how we look at the different parts. So we have status, and as I said, status is looking backwards. So this, I'm jumping around, sorry. So we can see here that the status refers to the amount of rainfall received over the past 3 months. So this is really important because sometimes we don't take that into account broadly when we're speaking about kind of forecasting. We don't consider the current context now, and we don't think about how it's been for the last 3 months. So the table you'll see in a second looks at what it's been in the past 3 months, and it gives a allocation. It gives a recommendation for C of seriously wet, near or wetter than normal, dry warning, seriously dry, severely dry, as a status, as a past 3 months. And then we get to add the outlook to it, so the coming 3 months. And that gives us, you can see on the slide here, as I say, I'll flick through, but you can see the small scales here, and they show us dry in the middle, which might look familiar from that La Nina slide we looked at before, and we look at the wetter above and below. And you can see as well on the slide some examples of where has been extremely wet, dry, and then what alert level that is. So the outlook gets an alert level, and then the status, as I mentioned before, that's getting like a seriously wet, wetter than dry. So we use these two pieces of information to give us recommended action. So this is really where we have, let me see if I can, I know that's super small, you can't really read it, but this is what it looks like on our tool. So the table below this, which looks like this, it's giving recommended level of action, particularly for Red Cross. So it's a Red Cross tool, it's for our Red Cross national societies to prepare for and respond to any of the conditions that we've deemed to be the current situation because of the status looking back and the outlook looking forward. So given the current status, so an example here, we can say, we can suggest some preparedness and early actions. So maybe based on the combination of rainfall status, so again, looking back past 3 months and going forward, we can say high action is needed for the dry conditions because rainfall has been much lower than normal for the past 3 months, and it is lower than normal rainfall is expected to continue. So that means we're going to potentially see a 6-month period of low rainfall, which can be significant if it's been past 3 months has been this, seriously dry, and it continues, and we're looking for lower than normal rainfall conditions to continue. So that really looks at our kind of overall outlook there. It really gives us a good picture of what conditions we're facing at a kind of zoomed out level. So and then we use this table and we put the countries. So you can see here low action for PNG, for Kiribati, West and East, and Tuvalu South. So I think this one was maybe from December. And we use the information, and we are able to then share for high action for dry, and same of course then for those countries facing wet conditions. So where needs to take action for wet. And I should flag here as well, when we have low action, if a country is sitting on, where are we? If a country is sitting on low action, so for example here we have low action for wet, you can see a whole heap of countries there listed for low action wet. This doesn't mean no action. So this isn't like, oh, it's okay, we've kind of got some rainfall that's happened for the last 3 months. We predict some more is going to happen. This is actually an indication for taking some early action. It's not the high action. It's not an extreme requirement. We haven't had high alerts, and we haven't had seriously wet or seriously dry, but we are seeing conditions, and these may worsen. So you can see, although rainfall has been normal or a little bit higher than normal for the past 3 months, it is likely that conditions may proceed to wet or very wet over the coming months. So this is where we need to do a bit of analysis. So it might have been that, the last 3 months have been kind of normal, but the next 3 months are looking really wet. So then we start to slot the countries in the correct kind of table for action. So hopefully that makes sense of the tool that we use. And it's really something that's been around for, I think, about 2 years. Obviously the data's been around much longer than that. But as a tool that we use to be able to try to do some analysis, it's been around, it's quite new, and for national societies, the use and uptake is still early because it's complicated and it requires a lot of investment. And if you look along the right-hand column here, the recommended actions, they're not easy actions, they're not straightforward, and there's not few of them. There's lots of recommended actions that national societies could take, and all super valuable. Many of them are interlinked with one another. So, as a standalone action, it might not be super valuable, but if it were to be linked with the rest of the list. So it requires a huge investment. And for many national societies, they're in response mode a lot of the time. So we find it very difficult to prioritize, this kind of ability to prepare, which is, again, another challenge. So, but one example where we were able to do this is in Tuvalu, as I've been mentioning and alluding to this session. So we'll pass to TJ in a second. We'll talk about what we did, but essentially we were able to use this regional ear watch to be able to look and see, okay, Tuvalu is sitting at high action. What we need to do something. We can see the forecast has been seriously dry and is continuing to be seriously dry. And in country, we also looked at the national ear watch, which was very, very helpful, and it was broken down by island. So we were able to see across the island, particularly Northern Islands and Tuvalu, where there was, and they use different terminology. So this is, again, where we can get a little bit confused. But they were seeing, drought-like conditions, drought conditions, severe drought, extreme drought, and wording like that. So we were able to use that and kind of compare and contrast with what information we had. And that led us to go for some funding in an internal Red Cross funding mechanism, which we'd never done before in the Pacific Red Cross region before. It's been done in other countries, but we were able to kind of use the earwatch and the national earwatch as a trigger to contact our colleagues at the Tuvalu Red Cross National Society and just begin having a conversation. And they had already been having conversations in their drought committee. So it really all kind of was a catalyst at the same time. The government didn't declare a state of emergency or a drought, which would be a normal way for us to get emergency response funding. But what we wanted to understand was whether the situation of seriously dry past 3 months, predicted dry coming 3 months, was going to have an impact at the community level. So I'll pass to TJ and she'll tell us what we did with funding, and then we will try and wrap up and have 2 minutes for questions.
All right, thanks, Jen. I'll try to go through this as fast and as clear as I can. So the funding that was able to be accessed by the National Society with the assistance of Jen and the Red Cross. Here in Tuvalu, we were able to conduct household surveys. So we were able to complete 1,477 household surveys across the 7 islands, covering questions related to water access, water stress, health, livelihoods, and access to early warning information. There was water sounding training and information gathering across all surveyed households. There was also development of SOPs, or standard operating procedures for drought, completed with in collaboration with the National Disaster Management Office on 6 islands with the island disaster committees of each island. Snafuti, the capital, already had an SOP in place. So with final versions and full endorsements across the 6 islands expected by the end of this year. Also, there was a drought awareness IEC, or information, education, and communication materials shared and distributed. This included alternative hand washing tips in times of dry periods, drought posters in Tuvaluan language as well, so that we can really reach and clarify our messages in a way that everyone here in Tuvalu can understand. So it's every raindrop is precious tips to improve water capture. There's also boiling of drinking water and radio programs here in Tuvalu. So this was for all 1,477 households that were surveyed under this funding. I think I'll pass it back to Jen.
Thanks so much, TJ. And I think the most successful part about this funding was kind of the findings that people, as I mentioned earlier, were generally doing well in terms of their water management and water access. I say water access, we mainly had some a few islands that had some challenges, but it was the kind of understanding generally around water management actually that was becoming challenging when and how long the dry period would last. How much water people were using, and their own levels of consumption, and just generally accessing maybe even community or government water sources and how that works and things like that. So we were able to uncover some of the gaps in the water management process, but the findings generally pointed to no response needed, which wasn't necessarily our thoughts going in. So it was really, really great to uncover this information and be able to say, okay, this is the forecast, this is the outlook, this is what we're seeing sort of meteorologically, but on the ground, we're seeing small pockets of rainfall topping up people's water tanks. We're seeing, good examples of water use and water management. We're seeing people having enough tanks in many places, but we are seeing challenges in terms of managing that, the water in people's tanks at the community level potentially. And also this sort of knowledge gap in how long the situation is going to last and how long do we need to be managing water in this particular way for. So it was really, really great. And then off the back of that, we were able to get some additional funding because we had data, we had information, we had local and household level information that enabled us to be able to say, okay, these are the activities we want to do to support people to be able to manage their water resources. So we were able to get funding from UNDP small grants for one of our islands so far, which we're hoping to do some rainwater harvesting repair, maintenance, training, along with a whole host of other kind of ability to manage water, so a bit more holistic, and being able to include most vulnerable members of society in those trainings and hear their challenges in terms of water stress. So it was a really great project. Thank you, TJ, for sharing. I think that's all we have time for. Maybe we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm fine to stay on a little bit. I know we've gone over slightly, apologies. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Some quick facts on the screen there for you to have a look at. We can share this presentation with David, who I'm sure can distribute it with the links and any other information you might need. But please feel free to ask us any questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, I have questions, but I'm going to let everybody else go first. Jennifer, I did have one question from somebody in the chat about getting like a PDF of your slides. Is that possible? Can I?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can include one with the like talking points as well, if that's helpful.
Okay.
I know we covered a lot.
Feel free to open your mic if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Again, my name is Jimmy. I'm here, based here at UH Manoa. David, nice to meet you. I guess we haven't met before.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
But I used to be co-steersperson with the Primo Hui some years back on communications. And thank you all for all that you guys do. I mean, this morning's, I call it a wake-up call. Many people sleep through it. You know, what happened in just south of Fiji could happen anywhere. And if people think that nothing happens, then nothing happens. But what happens when it does? So one of the first things I did real quickly was I went to the Pacific Disaster Center, of which I'm a member, and they are able to pull up really quickly and post the transit map for incidents or events, be it weather or tsunami and others. And they've got great products. So I'll if David's doesn't already have the link, I can send it to you guys. It's also called Disasterware. You can Google it. It's free. And if you're a recognized EM professional in your area or somebody involved in emergency management, you can get an account to get a little bit more detail what they share.
Yeah, sure. Put the link maybe in the chat to everybody. That's PDC, right? Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, there's so many really good resources and good tools. And it's like I think you were mentioning earlier about trying to make sure that information is accurate and correct, and coming from a reputable source, and that's what we're sharing, and that's what we can point people to, and that's a really good one. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll ask one of my questions. So a lot of what you mentioned water many times. So that, I mean, that's probably the most crucial resource. So let's say like with the volcanic eruption that happened recently and the ash fall, that's going to spoil a lot of the water resource. And then in the short term, you can ship in drinking water to, or you can, I guess, purify things so people can bathe and that type of thing. But in terms of the long run, is you just have to depend on nature to sort of heal the water source, or are there things that emergency managers can do to?
Good question.
Repair?
Yeah, it's a really good one. And I was listening into something last week about, the impact of the ash on rainwater tanks. And interestingly, there was a hydrogeologist, talking about if actually people let the tank settle for a day, they can still drink the water off the top. So as an immediate kind of, I think people were quite relieved to hear that it wasn't fully contaminated and completely undrinkable. But I think, I think there's probably two parts to it. Yes, we generally try to look to support what we would call nature-based solutions and enhance those. So where we can see good examples of nature bouncing back itself, what can we do in that kind of preparedness space to enhance and support that? So I'm thinking of the kind of classics around, let's not build a seawall, but let's look at where we've got good quality mangroves planting on the kind of seashore that's being eroded. Okay, let's make sure we're not blocking access for fishermen and things like that. But how can we support and enhance the existing, where we can see existing kind of restoration that happens naturally, and look to enhance that. And we have a project with Red Cross called Wired Out, And that really looks at those kinds of things with a kind of youth angle. So we try to do some youth empowerment, and they take on projects that look at, particularly look at, where they can see challenges, but they can see a kind of maybe natural or a locally based solution. And I think that's one of the ways we try to do that in the protection phase, the sort of, I guess, the adaptation part. And particularly looking at water source. And actually we have a project in Tuvalu with SPC, and it's around managing coastal aquifers and sort of looking at water sources. And we've combined some of the expertise from Red Cross side, so our volunteers, like local knowledge and access to some of these resources, with some skills in what we call citizen science. So it's really looking at surveying, but trying to enhance that kind of volunteer role, and have that knowledge and information and be a little bit more scientific, so we can share some of that information, and we can monitor water tables, and we can look at salinity, and we can see where there's degradation ahead of time again, so that when there's issues like inundation or storm surges, we can see where it's most vulnerable and how to try to support and protect that.
Okay. Okay, so if there don't appear to be any more questions, so maybe people might want to reach you later. Do you have how do people contact you?
You can contact me, and I'll put my email in the box. That's probably the easiest way. I'm also on Skype, and I can add that too. But if you have more kind of specific questions, probably email is good. But yeah, happy to hear any questions or connect with any colleagues on some of these initiatives. I know there's so much work going on, and some good stuff. I think Jamie sharing the chat as well. Thanks, Monica, also for putting some links into. So yeah, if anyone has any connections or questions, please feel free to reach out. And Tamala can put her email in as well. There's many initiatives happening in Tuvalu this year, and Tuvalu and Tamala working with colleagues at Tuvalu Red Cross. Plenty of things going on, so I think there'll be lots of experience there to share too.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Tamala. So I'm going to close out the webinar then. And thank you, and we'll see you again in March. Okay.
So everybody says aloha or hello or thank you from your host language. You can't close it otherwise. Seriously.
Hey,
Agreed.
Kasalalia from Weather Service.
Thank you, Ken.
That's what Ginger told me.
I'm going to say talofa on behalf of my colleagues in Tuvalu.
Yes. Salafa as well.
All right, so I'm the English guy at the townie. I guess I'll say thank you. Aloha.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Aloha, everybody.